Hello and welcome to the Jim podcast. This is, of course, your host, Jim. Today we'll be continuing our intro to Greek philosophy, and we're going to begin with Middle Platonism and then speak about Neoplatonism. So allow me to open up my notes here. Some interesting figures from Middle Platonism would be Atticus and Albinus, both of which had almost contradictory and opposing ideas of what Platonism actually should be. For Atticus, he was hostile to the Aristotelians. So in the first episode, we talked about the difference between the philosophy of Aristotle and the philosophy of Plato. And so he was one that held on to the more classical understanding of Platonism, which rejected Aristotelian understanding of logic and metaphysics. However, we then had Albinus, who was influenced quite greatly by Aristotle and by the teachings of other Aristotelians after Aristotle. So there's kind of two different subsets within Middle Platonism, in addition to the fact that, as previously mentioned in the episode on Stoicism, you had these Platonized Stoics and Stoicized Platonists. So there wasn't this very fine line where everybody was a completely different ideologue. There was a lot of overlap, where you had people who were, as I said, Platonist with Stoicism, and you had Platonists who had a good amount of Aristotelianism in their line of thought. And so Middle Platonism kind of was a departure from the more classical Platonism. Middle Platonism was also even more theological and religious in language, and was less just about some kind of ethic or creed. It understood the truths of the divine world, and they attained great likeness to God. That was the most important part, attaining some kind of likeness to God, and becoming more theological or religious in their understanding of philosophy. So, quite a departure from the classical philosophies that, even though Platonism was quite religious and theological to begin with, it's not what you would be able to call a theology proper. But with Middle Platonism, it did kind of become a theology proper. Apologies again for any road noise as I continue this podcast. I'm on the road filming this, obviously. Let me just turn my page. So with Middle Platonism, we have a combination of the supreme mind idea from Aristotle, and then with the good, which comes from Plato. So remember, the good, or the one, is from Platonic philosophy, and the supreme mind is from Aristotelian philosophy. It's more theological than classical Platonism, as I already mentioned. And the divine mind was the top of the hierarchy. So Aristotle's divine or supreme mind is the top of the hierarchy in this form of Platonism. Plato's transcendent forms become God's thoughts. So the thoughts of God are how we explain Plato's transcendent forms when looking at Middle Platonism. When we look at Albinus, okay, let's remember Albinus and Atticus very quickly. So Albinus was the one who was greatly influenced by Aristotelianism, even though he was a Platonist during the Middle Platonism period. And Albinus, the Aristotelian, said that the first mind, or God, was unmoved. The second mind, / world intellect, was through which he, the mind, operated. So we had this first one, and then we had the second mind, or the intellect, the world intellect, that was kind of the operating mechanism for the supreme / divine mind. Then the third would be the world soul. So we have a tripartite component here, at least in this beginning stage, when looking at Middle Platonism. Celsus, an enemy of Origen and an enemy of Christianity, belonged to this school, this Aristotelian Middle Platonism. Celsus says that God could not have created the body or anything mortal. Only soul comes from him directly. He also said God cannot come down to humanity, as it is a change for him, a negative change. So, it's interesting to see that brought up by Celsus, because so many times when speaking with Muslims, they'll invoke the spirit of Celsus to say that God cannot become man, so therefore the Trinity is false, the hypostatic union and the incarnation are all false, by nature of God changing his nature and becoming lesser, as in the book of the Hebrews, a letter to the Hebrews by the Apostle Paul. They became lower than the angels. They would reject that in the Christian scheme and would say that Christ would have to be created and would not be literally God, but maybe from God. And so Celsus and then later Muslims would use these exact arguments. The Middle Platonists allowed for some kind of intermediary divinity, so I suppose they would be alright with Arianism or semi-Arianism, where Christ is of God and he's from God, but he's not God. That is probably what they would be okay with on this topic of Trinitarianism versus Arianism. God is utterly transcendent in Middle Platonism, only to be glimpsed in seldom flashes of illumination. So, in a lot of ways, this again reminds me of Islam, where God cannot be known by literally any human way whatsoever. And so the only way really to know him is to know what he is and what he is not, which even Orthodoxy uses a bit of this apophatic theology as well. But in Orthodox Christianity, you can literally know God very easily through the Holy Spirit, through the Son, and through the energies, the activity of God. Whereas with Islam, not so. God is definitely much more of a distant figure that can only be glimpsed at in these kind of flashes. You can see this kind of thought is absolutely saturating Greek philosophy, and it is later saturating Islam as well, where these ideas of ultra-transcendence, this distant God that nobody can ever know, nobody can ever conceive of, you can't ask any questions about him, and he's not a close personal deity. People think this has to do with Arabian Semitism, but it actually seems to be a very Greek idea. I would even wager, and I've said this before, that if you removed all the Arabic calligraphy and you anglicized Muhammad's name the way we kind of anglicize Abraham, even though that's a very Semitic name, then people would see Islam as a Greek religion and not this foreign Eastern Arab religion which people assume it is. Anyway, we'll get on to Neoplatonism now. I've talked about Neoplatonism in little flashes and glimpses myself on this channel, but we've never really dove into it before, and that's what we're going to discuss today. So that's the introduction via Middle Platonism, and now we're going to get into Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism is definitely transcendence to the extreme. It is mainly Platonic with some Aristotelian, Stoic, and Oriental elements. Oriental meaning from Egypt. Plotinus was born in 205, and he died, I believe, 270. And he was a Hellenized Egyptian. That's AD, by the way. So this is not BC. Plotinus was a Hellenized Egyptian, and he was a monist. For him, reality is hierarchy, descending from beyond being to what is called below being. So in the scheme of Plotinus, you could actually be beyond being, and in many ways philosophers have said that God, in Catholicism and Orthodoxy, is beyond being, because he is so utterly transcendent. He's not even a being, because a being would be a category that's ill-suited for the supreme creator of all things. I don't think I would agree with that, to be totally honest. I think that's taking transcendence a little too far, and the Bible never says God is beyond being. So you'll notice that when we start to go over philosophy, some of it may be very familiar to you, because you say, oh, I've heard some church fathers talk like that, and I've seen theologians online talk like that. You can make your own judgment call on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Let's continue. The highest principle, or hypostasis, is God, or the One, in Plotinian/Neoplatonism. So Plotinian and Neoplatonism are almost synonymous. Neoplatonism includes other figures other than Plotinus, such as Ammonius Saccas. Today we'll be mainly doing Plotinus, so you could call this episode Plotinianism or Neoplatonism. It doesn't really make a difference. Anyway, for him, the highest principle or person, hypostasis, is God/the One. The One is itself beyond being, so even beyond the category of being, he's so utterly transcendent, and beyond mind. Even though in Middle Platonism, the mind is equated with God, in Neoplatonism, the One is beyond mind, and he's beyond being itself. The One is the source that all being derives from and strives to return to. Remember that. That's the most important part of Neoplatonism, in my mind at least. the utter transcendence and this fact that everything comes from the one, and everything needs to return to the one. And so life is kind of this labyrinth, this temporary puzzle to try to get back to the one. That's the whole topic. And so you'll notice that, such as, again, in Islamic theology, they always say this life is a test. You know, we used to be with Allah, and now we have to go back to Allah. Well, Plotinus already invented that theology some 500 years before Islam. And again, you can see the Hellenism, the Greek philosophy, absolutely saturating Islam. And yes, it does saturate a lot of Christianity as well. But Christianity doesn't hide that fact, whereas with Islam, people think it's this restoration of the Semitic religion, whereas there's an enormous overuse of Greek philosophy. Now, if some Muslim says, no, Jim, you're incorrect, that's only one class of Muslims who overuse the philosophy, then please, come in here and correct me. But from what I've seen, the mainline Sunnis all believe in this. This has nothing to do with some revealed Arabian religion, but rather the borrowing of Hellenism. It would be different if they mentioned the Greeks in their scriptures, but they don't. The Bible at least says that the Greeks are going to be the prospective Gentiles who have moved away from paganism. They have the unknown God as taught by Paul, Apostle Paul, Saint Paul. Now on to emanationism. The one is not diminished by emanation, though. You know, everything's emanation. We're all emanating from the one. But the one doesn't become diminished just because you and I have a conversation. We're not taking away from the one. The one is ineffably simple. The one cannot be the subject of any attributes. The one does not possess the quality of goodness, but the one is goodness itself. So he does not possess goodness. He's not like goodness. He doesn't have goodness. He literally is goodness. Alright, we'll now talk about the three hypostases. The three hypostases in the Plotinian Enneads are the one, mind/thought, and the soul, or world soul. These are the three hypostases in Plotinian philosophy, Neoplatonism. The mind comprises the world of forms and contemplates it to return it to the one. Multiplicity is introduced to the universe, and the causal principle identified with Plato's demiurge is what the mind is. The soul/world soul is divided into two. We have the higher soul, akin to mind, transcends material order. There's your materialism once again. Then we have the lower soul, or nature, the soul of the phenomenal world. All souls are emanations from the world soul, and like it, they have a higher element related to mind, and a lower element related to bodies. That includes our souls. Matter itself, unilluminated by form, is darkness, or non-being, and thus evil. So you can see how in Aristotelian metaphysics, materialism was good, and in Stoicism, materialism was good, and there was a rejection of transcendentalism. But here with Plotinus, right here, matter itself, which unilluminated by form, is darkness, non-being, and it's thus evil. So matter is evil. Even though the world is material, Plotinus says it can be good because it is ordered or created by the higher soul and held together by nature. So even though he says the world can be good, he's still starting out with this idea that material is bad. And boy oh boy, has that done a number on the Western psyche. Matter is intrinsically evil, but, Plotinus says, it is a reflection of the intelligible order, and it's called the best of all possible worlds. It's kind of like the plenum planarum, where as it is above, so it must be below. Anybody find any of this familiar? Yeah, definitely overused in some church history. The Bible doesn't mention anything even close to this, and Plotinus is not in the class of Plato, so we can't say he's like an inspired prophet, because he comes centuries and centuries later, and he came 200 years after Christianity was revealed, or at least 150 for his region. There was no excuse for him to not be a Christian. So, I do not believe we should be over-dipping into Plotinian philosophy. Everything is an outflow of the one, seeking to return. Remember that. Human soul is fired by heavenly eros from Plato's Symposium, if anyone's read that, to make the ascent to the one. So now we're going to talk about the ascent to the one. the Apollo mission. To get back to that one. Alright, hold on. Here are the stages of ascent of the human soul to the One. Number 1, we have the purification of sense perception, and you free yourself from your body. So immediately, look at this. Freeing yourself from your body is considered good. Material is considered bad. Material and body are considered darkness. Anybody else starting to see some of the issues with Plotinus' philosophy here? So purification of sense perception, and you free yourself from the body. That's step 1. Step 2, you rise to the level of mind, and you busy yourself with kind of an eternal contemplation of philosophy and science. But you're still self-conscious. But you're no longer body, you're all mind, you're all contemplation. Philosophy, that's the most important part. And number 3, union with the One. You have a mystical union mediated by ecstasy. Awareness of difference between subject and object is now lost. This state of ecstasy is only seen temporarily on earth. Plotinus' student, Porphyry, says his master was granted this experience 4 times in 5 years. Those are all my notes on Neoplatonism. As you can see, the West has been completely saturated with Neoplatonism throughout its history. Everything that I talked about, material being bad, body being darkness, the soul being superior. We have an extreme dualism here, where you have the world of souls and immaterial metaphysics and transcendentals. Then you have kind of the ruddy physical world, which is not transcendental. So God is transcendental, God is immaterial, God is good, immaterial is good, material is bad and dark. I mean, this has done a number on the Western psyche, as I said. And then, of course, this return to the One, which we can see is all too common in many religions, where you see this idea that we're all emanated from God and we have to return to God. That's the whole point of life. Rabbinic Judaism is also guilty of this, where they misinterpret Ecclesiastes by saying, if we return to God and we come from God, that must mean that we're eternal emanations of consciousness from the upper realm. But really all it means is that the energy that God used to create you returns back to Him. It has nothing to do with some kind of conscious pre-existence or with you returning to it. Because otherwise that verse could be used to justify heaven before the incarnation of Christ, which doesn't make sense in Christianity, and also doesn't make sense in Judaism because they don't really believe in that kind of an afterlife. And of course with Islam we already discussed the massive overuse of Plotinian philosophy. Yeah. Alright, well, thank you guys for listening to this introduction. Intro to Greek philosophy, intro to Neoplatonism.